Last week was our first playoff game, and my plaque psoriasis was so itchy under all my gear. Sometimes just thinking about scratching could take me out of the moment. And then my doctor told me I could get clearer skin with a pill called Otezla.
Otezla apremilast is a prescription medicine used to treat adult patients with plaque psoriasis for whom phototherapy or systemic therapy is appropriate. Otezla can help you get clearer skin after just 4 months.
Okay, ready for the next game. Talking to my doctor about a pill was a total game changer.
Don't use Otezla if you're allergic to it. Get medical help right away if you have trouble breathing or swallowing, swelling of the face, lips, tongue, throat, or arms. Severe diarrhea, nausea or vomiting, depression, suicidal thoughts, or weight loss can happen. Tell your doctor if any of these occur and if you have a history of depression or suicidal thoughts. Live in the moment. Ask your doctor about Otezla. Call 1-844-4-OTEZLA or visit Otezla.com for prescribing info about cost, and more.
How was sales conference?
Sales conference was extraordinary. What was that guy called with the teeth on the TV? Leland. Rylan. That's right. The Life of Rylan. That's right. The Life of
Rylan.
Yeah, good.
Other
See what they did there?
were. Wasn't there Alan Carr Anatomy or something? What was that?
I can't remember, but yeah, we had Alan Carr, we had Zadie
Car
Smith.
crash.
We had Zadie Smith, we had Jamie Oliver. It was a kind of, it was a kind of a Salmagundi of modern publishing genius.
What's a what?
Look it up, kids.
Salmagundi is a kind of it's like a sort of a dish with all sorts of different ingredients in
is
it.
it?
Yeah.
I've learned something already. We haven't even started.
There was a very famous highbrow American journal called Salmagundi. That's the only reason that Susan Sontag used to contribute to. Very highbrow. Always reminds me of that great joke of Woody Allen's where he said, dissent and commentary. I have this fantasy that the two of them will merge and form dysentery. But yeah, and it was good. I mean, it was amazing. It's traditional publishing, as we like to call it, at the top of its game. But none the less fun for that.
Where was it?
It was in a ghastly hotel on the outskirts. Well, it's supposedly in Birmingham. I'm doing cats.
Yeah, I saw a photo on Twitter of a conference.
But the logistics, it's vast now. I mean, hundreds. I think it's 1,000 people.
They don't all fit in one room.
And we had to do our presentation.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Wow.
We had to do our presentation twice. Once at the what seemed to me rather early time of 10 in the morning. And then
first house
again,
and second house.
Exactly. We were much better in the afternoon, Mathew.
Yeah, we were. I don't know why that was, John.
Yeah.
Everyone had been drinking, hadn't they, by then? Yeah.
Or had time to recover from the previous night's drinking, perhaps more to the point.
Yeah.
Hello and welcome to Backlisted, the podcast that gives new life to old books. As usual, we're gathered around the kitchen table of our lovely sponsors Unbound. You know them. They're the publishers who bring authors and readers together on a lovely website. And I'm John Mitchinson, publisher at Unbound, so I would say that about them, wouldn't I?
He's so slick now. He's slick. And I'm Andy Miller. And I'm the author of The Year of Reading Dangerously. And we're joined on the podcast by our producer, Matt, who is pointing.
He's saying, I'm supposed to say, by playwright, journalist and author Samantha Ellis, who's You were going to say.
No.
Go on, you go then. Go on. You read off the... Actually, you do this bit of the script.
All right.
Excellent.
Maybe we should have printed 2 scripts off.
Yeah, how come he gets a script and I don't?
I'm John Mitchison. I'm John Mitchison. Publisher at Unbound. I'm Andy Miller. I'm the author of The Year of Reading Dangerously. And we are joined, as usual, by the writer and shaman, Mathew Clayton. Hello, Mathew.
Hello, Andy.
Hello. And we're also joined by...
We're joined today by the playwright and journalist Samantha Ellis, whose book How to Be a Heron was published to multiple and copious plaudits in 2014. Hello, Samantha.
Hi.
Samantha has chosen the book we're going to be talking about in this show, Lolly Willowes, by Sylvia Townsend Warner. But first, as is traditional, I'm going to get Andy to ask me.
Yeah. Hey, John,
Yes,
out of
Andy.
interest, what have you been reading?
I'm obviously so pleased that you asked me that question, and I've been reading an extraordinary book called Snowy Tower Parsifal and the Wet Black Branch of Language by Martin Shaw. And the first thing I'd have to say about it is, I've said it's remarkable, but the second thing I'd have to say about it is not published in the UK, but I think you can get it. It's published by White Cloud Press in Oregon in the United States. Oof. So I think it is possible for you to get it on limited edition import.
What's his name?
Martin Shaw.
Would you describe him as a master storyteller?
I would say he's a master of many things. Oh. He is definitely a great storyteller. And the book is about storytelling. The book is, in a way, a retelling and an opening up of the 13th century poem Parsifal, which is one of the key elements of the Grail story, one of the key retellings of the Grail story, and obviously the basis of Wagner's opera, but also of much else, by the Minnesänger, the German sort of troubadour Wolfram von Eschenbach. I don't read medieval German, and I don't need to in this book because Martin's version of the story is published in full at the back as an appendix, so you can read the story straight without anything else. But then what he does is he takes it apart.
Is it fiction or non-fiction?
No, it's totally non-fiction. Right. He's basically writing about it's about storytelling and myth.
Right.
He's got a great thing. He is a teacher of myth. And in order to get closer to the sort of the deep roots of it, he lives in Dartmoor. So that's one of the odd things about the book.
Yeah.
Martin Shaw himself is based here, but his work is published.
So how did you hear about it?
I heard about it through the Dark Mountain Project, which is the brainchild of Paul Kingsnorth, who is the author of Awake, one of Unbound's authors. Yes. Basically, Paul did an event with Martin in Edinburgh last year, and Mark Rylance, who's bought the film rights to The Wake and reads brilliantly. If you know, Paul's novel is written in a shadow tongue, halfway between Anglo-Saxon and modern English. And Rachel, my wife, was there looking after all three of them and came back with Martin's book saying it was a really remarkable... Well, she said two things. It was a really remarkable event, and she said, you ought to go off and spend 4 days fasting up the mountain with Martin Shaw. It would be good for you.
Have you?
No, but I really do want to. Can I read you just a little bit, just to get you, just to give
she
you?
She meant the other Martin Shaw.
So let me give you a flavour of the book. I devoured this, and I haven't read a book. It's kind of Robert Bly, that sort of thing. I mean, I think he writes wonderfully. To tell Parsifal in a good way, I first took it back to the fireside for several years, to wood smoke and low-bellied badgers, rustling beds of nettles and 100 million stars overhead. Up on the lupine flank of Dartmoor, I once told the story for 3 days straight, eyes weeping from the wet kindling, great draperies of mist settling around our small gang, iron rain paddling our thin canvas shelter hanging from the oaks, the drops fierce thrumming around us. It gave the story a chance to stretch its handsome bones on Devon soil, to examine its frosty whiskers in the cool green reflection of a moorland lake. So I'm in for this.
So in one word then, is it a hit or a myth?
Oh,
thanks, Matt, for dragging us back down to earth. But it's a retelling of a story, and I think one of the reasons I was interested in it is his myth is about story and it's about imagination. He kind of has a bit of takes a bit of a pot shot at social media as low-hanging fruit, let's be honest. But what he says is that we're adrift in an epidemic of the literal, which I sort of know what he means. And one of the problems is that we have a general sense of... Well, there are two books out this week which I ought to like, but I have slight problems with. One is the book by Charles Foster, which is called Being a Beast. Mm-hmm. And the other one is called Goat Man. Now, these are two books that come out more or less at the same time about people actually pretending to be animals. Yeah. Now, I'm all for understanding animals, and we'll probably talk about a bit of this when we get on to Lolly Willowes. But, it's like... You don't actually have to go and eat worms and live in the garden. It's about using your imagination and our inability now to use our imagination. We sort of want everything to be fact-based. We want everything, unless we can actually put the worm in our own mouth, we can't imagine what it's like to be a badger or what it's like to...
Alan Bennett tells a brilliant story, but do you remember the actor Michael Bryant, who's no longer with us, sadly? Michael Bryant was a grand old man at the National Theatre, and... Alan Bennett scripted a revival of Toad of Toad Hall, Wind in the Willows. One of the features of this revival of Wind in the Willows is that the actors were taken to mime and movement classes to teach them how to move like rats and moles and weasels and what have you. And Michael Bryant attended the first day in his role as Badger. And on the second day, he said he didn't attend. And Alan Bannett rang up and he said, "The thing is, Alan, I've discovered the most extraordinary thing. This badger moves exactly like Michael Bryant."
Well, that's absolutely perfect, because that's sort of what is that stories are human things. We make stories that are kind of the core matter of the human material is story. Like Martin Shaw's, my last bit on his website, he says, "The business of stories is not enchantment. It's not escape. The business of stories is about waking up." And again, this will be the theme of waking up and awakenings, particularly the awakenings that have been kind of dislodged or made.
So that's called Snowy Tower.
It's called Snowy Tower, Parzival and the Wet Black Branch of Language.
Do you think it'll come out here?
I reveal my hand slightly. If I have anything to do about it, I really love us to do see if we can find a way of doing a UK version of it. It's remarkable, and it's not often that I read a book, as they say, in one sitting. But I did. I had spent all last Saturday reading it and getting more and more excited by it.
I would also recommend just thinking about books about stories and how stories are constructed. I don't know if anyone here's read John Yorke's book, Into the Woods, came out a couple of years ago. Wonderful, wonderful book. And he goes to the way that stories work, and it's all, you go into the woods to a new place and you come back with something that makes your home good again or right again. He did a talk for me in Brighton. I asked him at the end of it, I said, "What's the point of all this? What's the point of knowing this?" And he said, "The point of knowing this is you realise the difference between truth and lies, because when a story takes over, it becomes lies. And once you understand the structure of stories, you can see the ways that people have played with what actually happened and turned it to something else. And as soon as you start reading newspapers through that prism, it completely changed the way that I looked at the news and the way it's related to us. So you suddenly see the way that they've been...
How narratives
how narrative's been constructive and used to bend stuff.
Yeah. God, this is also... I feel Sylvia Townsend Warner just standing at the end of the street waving at us, saying, "Come on in." But before that, Andy,
yes,
you have also been reading. You've been working your way through that Bowie list.
I have. We've picked this up a couple of times now, but I think I just want to... This is the last time I'll talk about it, but you recall last time, anyone who listened to the last podcast, I read Puckoon because it was on David Bowie's list of 100 books. So since the last podcast, I've read a couple of more books from Bowie's list. I read English Journey by J.B. Priestley and The American Way of Death by Jessica Mitford. And so I'll say a little bit about each of those. Basically, I loved English Journey.
Isn't it great?
God, what a fantastic book. Fantastic book. The subtitle, being a rambling but truthful account of what one man saw and heard and felt and thought during a journey through England during the autumn of the year 1933.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating to read it in comparison with Orwell's The Road to Wigan Pier, which was written in the same period, which was commissioned by the same person. I think I'm right in saying... I think that's right.
I think it could easily be.
So Priestley is more to the right than Orwell. And yet, the thing that's wonderful about English Journey is, first of all, the depiction of a country in which, in 1933, he was travelling through the industrial north and was pretty horrified by what he found.
Yeah.
He was saying, this area of the country was despoiled and ruined and looted, and the money was rerouted to London to enrich the city, and the inhabitants were left to live amongst the slag heaps. Northern powerhouse. Anyway. So I found that absolutely fascinating. But also I really the thing I loved about English Journey was the extent to which Priestley gets that balance exactly right, which actually Orwell doesn't always, although Orwell's magnificent writer, Road to Wigan Pier, magnificent, but of being just the right amount of grumpy.
Yeah.
Right, and just grumpy enough to get away with telling you what he had for breakfast, whether it was any good or not, because he never stays in that mode for too long. It reminded me of that book by Paul Theroux.
Yeah, Kingdom by the Sea.
Kingdom by the Sea, which is a wonderful book, but is a slightly grimmer journey around the UK. I would assume that Bowie had read English Journey again, relatively young, and I can see why it would stay with you as a depiction of parts of the country that didn't feel like a period piece either. You know, I mean, in some respects, clearly. But
I mean, it's years since I read it, but I just remember because I'd had a bit of a jag of reading a lot of those H.V. Morton, in Search of books. And the other one, H.J. Massingham, who wrote a lot of the Batsford, and they are so addled by nostalgia for a kind of a lost Merry England that probably never really existed.
Which Priestley talks about specifically, saying the difference between Merry England and quotes unquotes Merry England, this thing which was already becoming a cliche in 1933 in terms of how it was represented in restaurants and advertising and what have you. And there was also a fantastic, if anybody follows me on Twitter, I shan't read it out, but I tweeted a paragraph about Priestley defending multicultural Bradford, which is just the most brilliant, stirring thing that you could read.
I can't remember. Is it a Penguin Classic?
Well, you know what? It's currently not in print in a paperback edition. No. So I bought the folio edition from the mid-90s. I picked that up second-hand for about a tenner, and it's full of the incredible photographs which were researched for the Jubilee edition in the mid-80s, where they've actually found the specific shops or mines or buildings that Priestley writes about. I cannot recommend it highly enough. It's a wonderful book. And the other one, then The American Way of Death by Jessica Mitford, a former star of Backlisted, Decca Mitford. I found American Way of Death, which is a book about...
She's Commie Mitford, isn't she?
Yeah, Commie Mitford, yeah. She's about the American funeral industry, written in the early 1960s. In one level, clearly very dated. I mean, it's like a fascinating mixture of investigative journalism written by a Mitford. So it's a combination of Watchdog and You and Non-You. But knowing her background and her communism, as an analysis of American capitalism and how it feeds into social practice, it's still brilliant. Brilliant book. And also the thing that's so fascinating about The American Way of Death is she had to persuade agent, publisher, everyone to take it on. And then, even to her own surprise, it became a phenomenal bestseller.
Wasn't it? Yeah.
It's one of the biggest selling books in America of the 1960s. And it's the reason why I'd never been able to make this connection. You know that Tony Richardson made a film of Evelyn Waugh's novel, The Loved One, in the mid-1960s. It's got a script by Isherwood and Terry Southern.
Oh, you tweeted about this as well.
It's shot by... I can't remember his name.
Haskell
Wexler. Yeah, and it's not a great film, even allowing for all those component parts. But I couldn't understand why this film had been... What a strange film to be made in the mid-60s. And the reason it was made is because The American Way of Death had been such a bestseller that they looked round and went, here's a film, what else have we got?
That'll do.
Yeah. And so this crazy post-Strangelove version of Evelyn Waugh gets made. Evelyn Waugh hated it, of course.
God,
the man,
brilliant.
Evelyn Waugh.
And is it available? Is it YouTubeable?
I want to watch it.
Yeah,
the
Love One.
Yeah.
It's around. Yeah, you can see it. I must say it wore every minute of its 2 hours quite heavily, but it was nice to see it. But the general point I wanted to make was these are all books from a list, from somebody else's list. And I really like lists. I feel like the unwelcome cousin at the TLS dinner, standing up and saying that. Because lists, people look down on lists, don't they? They're seen as being reductive. You know, we're all supposed to be perfect readers who can trot easily from subject to subject and genre to genre.
I have the perfect gift for you. Is lists of note. You can. It's a beautiful illustrate. In fact, in the introduction to Lists on Note, one of the things that Sean says is that human beings probably made lists before anything else, before they were sort of writing joined up sentences. You can imagine it is that sort of the simplest possible way of ordering experience. You could also say that all stories are lists. You know, stories are sort of things that are linked but in some sort of meaningful way.
I had this great experience with the Sight and Sound list of the 100 greatest films, which was published, when was that, 3 or 4 years ago. So I looked at the Sight and Sound list of the 100 greatest films, and I thought, okay, I've seen 33 of these films.
Roughly the same score as you scored on the Bowie list, if I seem to remember.
I work in thirds, imperfect thirds. But I thought, well, I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to watch all of these films And what happened was, at first, it was like aversion therapy. But actually, it massively expanded my horizons in terms of what I thought about when I watched a film and what I expected from a film and what I understood about art house cinema and what it was trying to do. It just seems a really democratic way of handling recommendation. And I don't really understand why people get uptight and snobby about it.
Well, I mean, people do because they think it's some sort of... It's cutting off other things. All lists are kind of exclusion. But that's... You kind of can't, as I confessed on the last podcast, it's really hard to live without a list. But the point is they're also... It's laying out... I always think the oldest... The most successful format of all Desert Island Discs is just a list of your favourite records. And anyone who doesn't make lists of things, that would seem to me to be a far more weird way of...
I also think there's a sort of E.M. Forster-ish mistrust of the clerks improving themselves.
Yeah.
That Leonard Bass thing about this guy should know his place and be educated properly and not seek to do himself.
All the earliest cuneiform tablets, the earliest examples of writing that we had were basically just it was accounts. It was people writing, other lists of ingredients, or the king has ordered 10 vats of beer. The Sumerians are very keen on beer. That's one of the many reasons they're underrated as a civilization.
As an ancient culture.
Yeah, as an ancient culture.
Where do they come in your list of top 10 ancient?
Of course, the earliest work of literature that we have is the Epic of Gilgamesh.
I think we should work on a top 10 list of lists.
Well, a list of note is in fact a list of lists. It's a meta list. And there's a list in there of Galileo's shopping list of things I'll need to build my telescope. And there's also a Michelangelo shopping list where he's drawn pictures of apples and things that he needs to...
I'm quite surprised that the shopping lists of Sylvia Townsend Warner aren't available to peruse, given her mastery of every other form.
You've hit on the slight snobby. I suppose you'd find Shakespeare's laundry list interesting. That there was that. And the answer's got to be, of course,
of course you would. Yeah, absolutely.
We'll be back in just a sec.
We're joined by Samantha Ellis, author of the book How to Be a Heroine. Samantha, I wanted you to come and talk to us about Lolly Willowes by Sylvia Townsend Warner, because if it wasn't for you, I never would have read it. I read it last year and I was totally blown away by it because I read about it in your book. Could you tell us a bit about your book so we can understand why you wanted to write about Lolly Willowes?
Yeah, well, so How to Be a Heroine came out of an argument that I had with my best friend. We were sort of making a pilgrimage up to Top Withens, which may or may not have inspired Wuthering Heights. Probably not, actually. There's a plaque on it that basically says you've just come here for nothing. Like it's really the most kind of unromantic plaque you've ever seen. But anyway, we were making this pilgrimage and we started arguing about which heroine we liked best, Jane Eyre or Cathy Earnshaw from Wuthering Heights. And I was going, obviously Cathy. I can't even believe Jane Eyre's part of this conversation. She's so boring, and she's sort of smug and, she doesn't really sort of do anything. Cathy's all wild and passionate and she's sort of running in the rain and the wind. And it was kind of quite Wuthery, as we were going up the hill. And my best friend Emma, said that, Cathy is really selfish and she's violent and she's a snob and she ruins everyone's lives. She marries the wrong man and everyone's lives are ruined. The man, everyone else, all their lives are all ruined by this. And I started thinking, well, okay, maybe she's got a point. My friend was going, she's clever, she doesn't care what anyone thinks. Then we got to the top of the slope and the sun came out and there was no more Wuthering and this plaque was going, there's no romance here. And I thought maybe I'll go home and I'll reread those two books and just see if I've sort of pretty much based my life on Wuthering Heights, on Cathy in particular. I thought maybe this hasn't led me to be as happy as I possibly could be. And, she ends up a restless ghost. Sorry, spoiler for Wuthering Heights, but she ends up a restless ghost. Oh, no. Jane Eyre, less unhappy at the end. I won't spoil that one. Anyway, I reread those two and then I just kept rereading and finding all these different heroines. And one of the books that I came to was Lolly Willowes, one of the books I came back to was Lolly Willowes to look at again.
Now, you've written How to Be a Heroine is what we could call a biblio-memoir And I too have written. Well, we wouldn't, but people do. But I too have written what is called Biblio Memoir.
Of course, you like lists. Your bloody books are lists.
Yeah, well,
it hadn't even occurred to me. So carefully had you concealed.
Yes, I concealed that. But I want to ask you a question. That what did you ever think? Well, why would people want to read me writing about books? Why wouldn't they just want to read the book?
No, this didn't occur to me at all. I mean,
Me neither.
First of all, can I just say the word bibliomemoir? I had never heard it until someone said, "You've written one."
Literally heard it for the first time this afternoon.
Well, good. I mean, it's such a weird word.
Rick Jakowski. He coined it. He coined it.
But I mean, I never sat. And secondly, did F.R. Leavis worry about writing about books? I mean, I'm not comparing us to. Yes, I am. I'm comparing us to F.R. Leavis.
That's quite right.
But also, no one asked him that question. The tradition of, I mean, I don't think we've written literary criticism, but the tradition of looking at literature and looking at characters and looking at stories and trying to work out how they relate to our own lives. We didn't, sadly, invent it, Andy.
I know. It's funny, that.
I'd love to have invented something, but no.
I also think,
like, at the tail end of hundreds of years.
If you wrote a book about a car, no one would say to you, "Why didn't you just go for a drive?"
I completely agree. Or build a car.
Exactly.
But I think that's absolutely. It seems to me totally valid that stories generate other stories, and both your books are actually books. They're not works of literary criticism. I mean, there are elements of that in it, but that's what I think gives them, dare I say it, the life. I mean, Andy, from our days in Waterstones, there was only one shelf smaller than the literary criticism shelf. I'm struggling to remember what that shelf was now, but it was the slowest stock turn bit of.
Indeed, it was.
But not hardly surprisingly, because who wants to read a sort of, dry academic dissertations on literature?
Also, I think in Samantha's case, and I hope in mine, I really think that your book puts books into the real world and into the real experience of readers that outside of the classroom or outside of the university campus, and tries to put books onto buses or book groups or places where we disagree or how we feel about them,
And the point is that requirement, as you know, the podcast study, because people spend a lot of time asking people like me and you who do read a lot, whose sort of jobs have revolved around it, what should I read?
Yeah.
And that anxiety is a real one.
So, Lolly Willowes by Sylvia Townsend Warner. We do this on Backlisted. I'm just going to read the synopsis on the back of my 1995 Virago Modern Classic.
Which is quite a lot longer than the one on my 2012.
Actually, and I've just nicked Samantha's copy here, which is 2000. The blurb gets shorter edition to edition. Yeah. But I'll just so to give us the synopsis of the plot of Lolly Willowes. So let's do that first, and then we'll talk a little bit about why you wanted to write about it. Lolly Willowes is a 28-year-old spinster when her adored father dies, leaving her dependent upon her brothers and their wives. After 20 years of self-effacement as a maiden aunt, she decides to break free and moves to a small Bedfordshire village. Actually, I have to say, it's a village in the Chilterns. Bedfordshire is not specified. Here, happy and unfettered. I'm just saying, as I'm married to somebody from Bedfordshire, I'm very Bedford aware.
Does Bedfordshire still exist?
There goes our Bedford listener.
I always think of going up the wooden stairs to Bedfordshire.
Yes. Oh, do you? Yeah. Anyway, Lolly Willowes.
A little bit of childhood there, just thrown in for free.
A small, arguably Bedfordshire village. Here, happy and unfettered, she enjoys her new existence, nagged only by the sense of a secret she has yet to discover. That secret and her vocation, and you may wish to switch off now, listeners, if you don't want to hear spoilers. That secret and her vocation is witchcraft. And with her cat and a pact with the devil, Lolly Willowes is finally free. An instant and great success on its publication in 1926. Lolly Willowes is Sylvia Townsend Warner's most magical novel, deliciously wry and inviting. It was her piquant plea that single women find liberty and civility, and her pursuit of the theme Virginia Woolf later explored in A Room of One's Own. Now, I actually think that is a pretty great blurb. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Samantha, are those the reasons that you wanted to write about it in How to Be a Heroine?
I was, I had found myself suddenly single after one of the reviewers of my book. I was beginning what one of the critics of my book called my loveless 30s. I would argue that the love of friends and family was very much part of the late part of my 30s. But anyway, I found myself single, and I just thought, where are the spinster heroines? I didn't want to be Miss Havisham, sitting there in my mouldering wedding dress surrounded by the kind of mouldy cake covered in mice and spiders. I didn't want that. I went back to Persuasion. Anne Elliot is 27, and also she's longing the whole time to be married. Cold Comfort Farm, I love Flora Pace, but she's so cheerful, come on. I wasn't feeling that entirely the whole time, that cheerfulness. So then I found this book, Lolly Willowes, and it's 1926, it's published. It's the heyday of the spinster novel because, sadly, there were loads of spinsters. They'd all lost their sweethearts in the war. And actually, Virginia Nicholson's book, Singled Out, is really good on this because some women quietly moved in with their lovers. Here I am with my female friend. We just share a flat in Bloomsbury. Fine. It was actually, for some people, very liberating, but for some people it was sort of awful, and there's some terribly sad books. I read this terribly sad book called Consequences by E.M. Delafield. And this woman sort of can't find love, and she ends up a nun, and she hates it, and then she tries to stop being a nun, and her teeth have all rotted for reasons that aren't even explained, And she ends. I'm going to tell you, and she's single. Yeah, it's true.
Yes.
It's amazing.
We warned you.
Better dental health you have once in a relationship, and she ends up. I will spoil this for you because it's so bleak. She ends up putting stones in her pockets and drowning herself in the ponds on Hampstead Heath because she just cannot think of anything else to do.
Was that the women's swimming pool?
It's never specified. I mean, bless her. She didn't even go for a swim. It's so awful. It's so awful. And that was 1919. And then this book comes along and it's not like that at all. It's funny, it's subversive, and it has got a lot about the sort of grimness of being a maiden aunt. But then she finds a way out, and it's not any of the ways out that anyone would expect it to be.
I have to say, I thought, well, I'll ask John what he thought in a sec, but I love the way that you think you're reading, and this is a high-risk strategy in a novel, you think you're reading one book, and then halfway through it becomes something totally different and unpredictable.
Yeah.
And then when you go back and read it again, she seeded it all the way through. Yeah. There's a little bit, I just want to read this, just a few sentences very early on. She would take the air in Hyde Park and watch the children on their ponies and the fashionable trim ladies in Rotten Row and go to the theatre in a cab. London life was very full and exciting. There were the shops, processions of the royal family and of the unemployed, the gold tunnel at Whiteley's and the brilliance of the streets by night. She thought of the street lamps, so impartial, so imperturbable in their stately diminuendos, and felt herself abashed before their scrutiny. Each in turn would hand her on, her and her shadow, as she walked the unfathomed streets and squares, etc., etc. I mean, the two things to say about that are foreshadowing, metaphorically and literally, and the second thing is, how beautifully written is that? I mean, just the little cavalcade of phrases there is beautiful.
And it's her first novel.
It's an astonishing. It's an astonishing. I mean, it's just beautifully written. Also, I discovered it. She submitted her poetry, of which more anon, to the publisher, and he'd asked if she had anything else, and she said, "Oh, I've been fiddling around with this novel, and maybe perhaps you'd read it," and sends it in, and of course, you know, the editor falls on it. I mean, it is one of the most beautifully written novels I've read in a very long time, and I mean, it has that incredible kind of.
You're referring to.
Just keep. I see the hazard lights going off. But you know, without it's to tell a story, and the story, as you say, it's such a brilliant story and so unexpected. As you say, it is suited. But when it finally goes, she has this epiphany off Moscow Road, a little a kind of flower shop, where she has the epiphany about wanting to move to the country. And it's just such a brilliant bit of writing.
And also, you would have to say, but that because this was her first novel, it's held together. Not by craft, though there is craft in it, but just her talent. It's held together by her energy and her talent.
And this extraordinary character, Laura Willowes, who is just one of the most remarkable characters I think I've read in literature. I mean, you start off as a spinster. As you say, she's totally, in a way, unbiddable. She's sort of strangely disconnected from the family around her. She goes along with... She sort of plays a game. She's a tomboy and she ends up sort of playing the game. But then there's that fantastic moment when she suddenly decides, no, I'm going to do something different.
But even before that, she's deeply eccentric. So she, like Sylvia Townsend Warner, Laura Willowes is educated at home, which means she isn't really educated. So she just has the run of the library. And she just doesn't really know how you're supposed to behave. And there's a wonderful moment where she gets set up with this boring lawyer called Mr. Arbuthnot. And she says, I'm going to read it. Shall I read it?
Yeah,
because
please.
it's so good. This is the last of many setups by her dreadful kind of brother.
Boring brother and his wife.
And the wife is so boring at one point.
That moment about the grave clothes folded in Jesus' tomb.
Yes.
And she said, I really wish I hadn't.
Laura says, how come your clothes are folded so neatly? And she says, well, it's like the grave clothes in Christ's tomb. We always should emulate it. And you just go, wow.
Such a brilliant moment.
But this is Laura on a sort of, set up, not quite a date, but set up dinner. Her remarks were, as a rule, so disconnected from the conversation that no one paid much attention to them. Mr. Arbuthnot certainly was not prepared for her response to his statement that February was a dangerous month. It is, answered Laura, with almost violent agreement. If you are a werewolf, and very likely you may be, for lots of people are without knowing, February, of all months, is the month where you are most likely to go out on a dark, windy night and worry sheep. And you just think, he does not call again.
One of the other things that's so wonderful about this book is she manages to do that thing, again, I think through force of personality, really, of telling you a story where you want to know what happens next. Okay, well, that's what you want from a novel. But also being very thoughtful, philosophically thoughtful, and also being quite weird. And as we said, the novel takes a very peculiar twist at the halfway point. But also funny. I mean, it's so funny. It's so brilliantly turned in terms of phrase for phrase. Mathew, did you get the thumbs up from Clayton?
Well, I had the problem I had with it is actually got a lot to do with the packaging of the book. So I had the edition that John's got, which it does look like a Jojo Moyes book. Yeah, and it couldn't be further away from that.
Nothing wrong with Jojo Moyes, but
we hasten to add, yes, absolutely,
it's not.
But I wouldn't read a Jojo Moyes book personally. And I picked it up and I started reading it, and I just couldn't get into it at all. I was like,
right.
Because it's so different at the start from what happens later on.
Yeah.
So I tried it because I've started it a month ago or something like that.
Yeah.
I just couldn't get into it. And then I read a bit more about her, and she sounded like an amazingly fascinating person.
Yeah.
Read about a bit more about the book itself, because it's the weird thing of reading it on Kindle. Is you see the cover, but you don't read the blurb on the back. So all I knew about the book was literally the front cover of it. When I read a bit more about it, I was like, God, this is like a book totally written for me. A book about someone who moves to the country and become a witch. That's like my dream.
You live in Lewis, don't you? Or near Lewis.
And you are a shaman.
I am a shaman.
So, yeah, exactly. Shall I say a bit about Sylvia Townsend Warner? Would that be appropriate at this juncture?
Most appropriate.
So, actually, I'm going to lie to anybody. I am cribbing this out of the front of my edition of Lolly Willowes, because it's so good. I'm going to add a couple of other things as we go along. Sylvia Townsend Warner, born in 1893 in Harrow, the daughter of George Townsend Warner, housemaster and head of the modern side of Harrow. As a student of music, she became interested in research in the music of the 15th and 16th centuries and spent 10 years of her life as one of the 4 editors of the 10-volume compilation Tudor Church Music. In 1925, she published her first book of verse. With the publication of the novels Lolly Willowes in 1926, Mr. Fortune's Maggot and The True Heart in the 2 following years, she achieved immediate recognition. One of the things we should say about Lolly Willowes is that Lolly Willowes, for its relative obscurity now, was actually a huge critical and commercial success on publication.
Yeah. It was huge in the States. It was the first ever choice for the Book of the Month Club, which is the big American book club.
So we should also say that she was a communist. She was a card-carrying communist. She witnessed the Spanish Civil War firsthand. She published 7 novels, 4 volumes of poetry, a volume of essays, 8 volumes of short stories, a biography of T.H. White, much acclaimed, and a translation of Proust's Contre Saint-Beuve. She lived most of her adult life with her close companion, Valentine Ackland, a lady, in Dorset, then in Norfolk, and again in Dorset, where she died on the 1st of May 1978 at the age of 84. Now, the one last point to make about Sylvia Townsend Warner's novels is actually, I thought there is a real parallel with the author who we did on the very first backlisted, J.L. Carr, which is that no two of Sylvia Townsend Warner's novels are the same. They are fascinatingly different from one another, and I speak as someone who's read 2 of them in the last week, in addition to Lolly Willowes. I want to come and talk about those in a little bit. But
the other bit about her biography that bit doesn't say, but which I think Sarah Waters says in the other edition, is that the reason she got the gig doing the 4-volume musical history was that she had an affair with the music teacher at Harrow, who was a lot older.
Which is what this book, comes out of. Yes, because he was, so she was having an affair with this married man, and she was living in this sort of horrible kind of half-life. She didn't really have very much money. She was living on winkles and cigarettes and black coffee and scrambled eggs, apparently.
That's your diet, isn't it?
And she was sort of not really, you're seeing a married man, you're not having a full, she wasn't having a full life, and so she's writing about someone yearning for a full life. I think that's the sort of thing. So she never wrote an autobiography, even though she wrote in almost every other form, because she said she was too imaginative to write one. And so she says she was born with a caul, which the midwife claimed and sold to a sailor. She says that she read Mackay's Popular Delusions when she was and when she was a child, and she used to say the spells to she used to say them to her cat, hoping the cat would turn into a devil. So this is in many ways sort of dream come true for her, that it's sort of that she is able to kind of write about a sort of very devilish kitten that sets the whole witchcraft story off. That's her as a kid on the stairs with her black cat, willing it to become the devil. She sort of makes a lot of her dreams come true. And actually, after writing Lolly Willowes, she sort of released herself into a much happier life with this poet, Valentine Ackland. And they were together 40 years. And they lived a slightly kind of witchy kind of life in lots of ways. They used to sell chestnut jam and rhubarb chutney and nasturtium seeds, to supplement her income from writing, even though she wrote all those books. But she was selling these sort of jams and chutneys in this village in Dorset. They became a pair of Lolly Willowes.
I mean,
and could you we ought to say, shouldn't we, that the metaphor of witchery in the second half of the book is very self-consciously feminist, right?
So they're sort of outlaws, the witches, and she talks about women all over Europe, unregarded as blackberries, just springing up all over the place.
That phrase.
Oh, it's beautiful, isn't it? And this idea, there's just this sort of profusion of it, and the sort of deliciousness almost of it, but the sort of, you wouldn't notice them, the sort of prickliness, the brambliness
and
of
there's that exact phrase, isn't there? She says that one becomes a witch not to do mischief or harm people, but to, quote, to have a life of one's own.
A life of one's own.
Virginia Woolf, isn't it?
It's before Room of One's Own. And the idea of a life of one's own, I think, is sort of bigger, isn't it? She's wanting to sort of break out of, being as herself, being a mistress, and sort of, I'm sure she enjoyed writing about Tudor church music, but, she releases herself into a bigger life, I think.
I love it. She says, in places like Bedfordshire, this is the long speech that she gives. Are we allowed to say who she gives the speech to? Maybe we should keep a little bit back, but a rather startling character who takes over the sort of the last third of the book. I see them, wives and sisters of respectable men, chapel members and blacksmiths and small farmers and Puritans. In places like Bedfordshire, the sort of country one sees from the train. Well, there they were. There they are, child-rearing, housekeeping, hanging washed dishcloths on currant bushes, and for diversion each other's silly conversation, and listening to men talking together in the way that men talk and women listen. Quite different to the way women talk and men listen, if they listen at all. And there's just that sense of a kind of this eruption of extraordinary female energy that, that kind of routine and having to... There's a brilliant... I thought it was one of the best... There was so much to do in the house when she was living in the house with her tedious brother and his wife. There was always so much to do to fill the day, and she writes brilliantly about the servants. And I think there's a maid that goes into the room, and she looks out on the day with no sense of surprise, because she'd been up since dawn,
But there's the moment where she decides to. So she comes home. She's 47. She's been sort of living with her family for 19 years, and then she sort of comes home and says, "Actually, I'm going to move to Great Mop, and it's a village in the Chilterns." And she keeps saying the population. I think it's 227. She keeps going pop 227, and they keep going, "What are you talking about? Aunt Lolly, what are you talking about?" And they think she's gone nuts. And then she says to her brother, "Well, I mean, I've got an income." She has an income that he goes, "Oh, well, I can't allow it. And then he sort of goes, "Actually, I've lost most of it.
Yeah.
I've invested it in it." And he tries to bluster his way through. He goes, "Well, these dividends don't always, you've lost it. You've lost the system. You were supposed to safeguard it. She didn't know what she was doing with it, and you were supposed to look after it, and you've lost it." And she goes, "Well, I won't be able to get a thatched cottage, and I won't be able to get a donkey, but I can still go." And she goes. It's this extraordinary kind of the sort of resistance to the sort of financial power that they've had, the control they've had over her, just by having her to live in their smaller spare room, not their larger spare room.
Yeah, I love that bit.
I found that reading of the book really, really interesting. But the thing I found when I read it last year, after you recommended it to me, that really struck me is the way that the novel starts off as a kind of almost an Edwardian comedy of manners, and then morphs into this peculiar Arthur Machen, like Arthur Machen, author of The Great God Pan.
Yeah.
There's this strange, it's like a Beryl Cook pagan ceremony.
It's sort of illustrated by Stanley Spencer.
But also, I was
that
really
amazing
struck by that.
passage. Do you remember the Piper at the Gates of Dawn chapter in Wind and the Willows?
Yes,
there is that.
That's very of its time.
And also,
at the same time, Machen was her brother-in-law.
Yeah, and she was friends with the Powys brothers as well. So there was this sort of... I mean, what I love about it, though, is that as somebody who's moved out of London to live in a village, she's so brilliant at capturing this sort of... She doesn't really want to get on with the villagers at all, and that there's this sort of...
That's really true. Yeah. Yes, that's very funny.
She doesn't sort of throw herself into village activities, but she kind of...
she makes scones, doesn't she?
Yeah, she does.
Shapes of the villagers, and they go a bit wrong. And then one of them comes round, and Mr. Saunter ate the strange shapes without comment, quietly splitting open the villagers and buttering them. Great. But she notices they're all a bit odd. Everyone in the village is a bit odd, and she doesn't know why. And this is sort of the start of her sort of investigation.
Tell us about the thing with the cat.
Oh,
so the cat finds her, right?
Well, so she's got to this village and she's having a lovely time, and then her
Mrs. Leek,
Mrs. Leek,
living in Mrs. Leek's house as a lodger.
Yeah, the landlady who makes a quite sort of dandelion cowslip wine and stuff, and it's a bit of a character.
They bond over sort of because she's always wanted to make things. She's always, since her nanny told her about mugwort, and she's always wanted to make decoctions and kind of tinctures of strange hedgerow plants.
Yes, so she's there, she's having this sort of time, and then her dreadful nephew turns up. And I was going to say, in all books of this period, sorry to all the men around this table, but if a man writes, he's definitely bad news. All the men who write are really bad news.
Can confirm.
I mean, you're all lovely, but Titus Willowes turns up, and he's been a sort of fat, lordly child, and now he's a sort of
Oxbridge
annoying
graduate.
Yeah, so he wants to write this book. And, he turns up and goes, "Oh, this looks like a brilliant writer's retreat. I shall stay here with my aunts." And she's just...
Manspreading.
Oh, no.
It's a brilliant bit of manspreading.
It's awful. And she's sort of thinking, "I wish he'd go away, And this kitten turns up, just as she's been saying to the woods, "How can I make him go?" And this kitten turns up, and I don't think we should spoil everything, but saves her, really. The kitten's called Vinegar. She calls kitten Vinegar. And one of the things one of the things she's able to do is she doesn't do anything terrible to Titus, but one thing she does, which stops him really writing his book, is she sours his milk. Just daily. You can't write with sour. How can you write that way? You can't make any tea.
I love. We're doing passages. I love. This is earlier in the book at her father's gravesite, and it's that one of the first intimations that you get that she's. I mean, she's not interested in religion, but this is the bees droned in the motionless lime trees. A hot, ginny churchyard smell detached itself in a leisurely way from the evergreens when the mourners brushed by them. The sun, but an hour or so declined, shone with an ardent and steadfast interest upon the little group. In the midst of life, we are in death, said Mr. Walbury, his voice sounding rather shameless, taken out of church and displayed upon the basking, echoless air. In the midst of death, we're in life, Laura thought, would be a more accurate expression of the moment. And it's just brilliant. I love the way the vicar's voice sounds sort of shameless outdoors, not that Church of England kind of drone.
Yeah.
But as you say, seeded through the book, the rebellion when it comes ought to be ridiculous and it ought not to work at all. But it's one of the most, I just thought it was one of the scene where she comes and she just announces at dinner that she's going to be moving.
It's really it's funny and exhilarating, which is a really interesting combination that you don't get together very often, actually.
She has a sort of, I've got to say, she has a sort of almost a sort of sexual awakening as well. Because can I read you a little bit? So she goes to, of course, once she's a witch, you have to go to a witch's sabbath, and they're all dancing. And at first she goes, I don't think I like this. I never liked dances. It's awful. It's just as bad as being at a kind of awful dance in town. And then these depressing thoughts were interrupted by red-haired Emily, who came spinning from her partner's arms, seized hold of Laura and carried her back into the dance. Laura liked dancing with Emily, the pasty-faced and anaemic young slattern who she had seen dawdling about the village, danced with a fervour that annihilated every misgiving. They whirled faster and faster, fused together like two suns that whirl and blaze in a single destruction. A strand of the red hair came undone and brushed across Laura's face. The contact made her tingle from head to foot. She shut her eyes and dived into obliviousness, with Emily for a partner. She could dance until the gunpowder ran out of the heels of her boots.
Oh, that's great, isn't it?
I mean, she's having a nice time.
Matthew, I don't want to miss the chance of a tenuous link.
The tenuous link, do we feel one?
Yeah, no, weirdly, there is a tenuous link. So in previous podcasts...
You say weirdly. Surely by now it's not.
Weirdly, we've done tenuous links to Andy, we've done a tenuous link to John before. And there's actually a tenuous link to me in Sylvia Townsend Warner, which is that... So I live in a village in Sussex called Kingston. And I discovered that she was a regular visitor to Kingston, in fact. And she used to go and stay with Ian and Trekkie Parsons. So Ian Parsons was the chairman of Chatham and Windus, her publisher. I think when she started, he was a kind of junior then. He ended up being the boss. And Trekkie was his wife. That was her nickname. But that's what everyone knew her as, and she was an artist. And they were they were in Kingston, which is just down the road from Rodmell, where Leonard Woolf and Virginia Woolf lived. And after Virginia died, by walking down to the river with her coat full of stones, Trekkie had a relationship with Leonard. She stayed with Ian, but for 30 years or so, she was quite a lot younger then. They had a relationship. It was never really clear whether it was consummated or not, but she'd go on holiday with him every year. She'd go on holiday with her husband as well. And Ian Parsons, had a long-standing affair with Nora Smallwood, who was also the boss of Chatham Windus, a kind of legendary female publishing figure. So I kind of think it's just interesting that, like, Sylvia had an unconventional life, and she had all these friends around her that had this kind of... They were very respectable, but they were kind of unconventional. And people in the village have said to me, when I've asked, "Oh, what do you do?" and I say, "I work in publishing." They say, "Oh, there used to be a fellow up the road who worked in publishing." And people have said that to me before, and they never knew who it was until this week when I discovered who it was through reading about Sylvia Townsend Warner, which is fantastic. So I walk past that house all the time, and I'll think of her every time I do that from now on.
And she's remarkable. I get the feeling. I mean, I've been reading her letters. I've got one of my most treasured possessions is a selection of her letters edited by William Maxwell, who I had the great fortune to publish at the very end of his life. He was the fiction editor for 40 years of The New Yorker. And like I said earlier, she had this early success with Lolly Willowes in America, but then became one of the regular people who had their short stories published in The New Yorker, none of which I've read, but which I sort of want to go back to. Because
they're about elves, aren't they? They're kind of elfin kingdom. It sounds
towards the end of
extraordinary.
their life, yeah.
And he anyway, this lovely sort of dedicated copy of the letter saying, my 3-year labour of love. She made Maxwell her the literary executor. So
Maxwell said of her, just to interrupt John, Maxwell said, he wrote, Sylvia Townsend Warner once said, "I write short stories for money, but it was quite untrue." She wrote to please herself and because she had no choice.
She just comes across as one of, there are most often with writers, you read them rather like Samantha was saying, you kind of, actually, maybe Kathy wasn't a very nice person.
Yeah.
But, you sometimes with writers, you read them and think, I love their work, but I really wouldn't want to have dinner with them. I can't think of anyone I would more love to have spent an evening with than Sylvia Townsend.
Yeah.
She reminds me, we had until recently, in fact, when she just died at 102, we had an elderly woman archaeologist in the next village. And in fact, there were two elderly women archaeologists, both living by chance next door to one another.
Wait for an elderly archaeologist to come along.
But they used to make jam, and you felt they were had that sort of witchy kind of, but also connection with, and there was it reminded me that in the book she writes about wanting to keep a donkey, and I remember Nancy Saunders, because Nancy Saunders also another link here, tenuous link. She was as N.K. Saunders, because she didn't want to be known that she was a woman, particularly as a scholar. Was that she translated the Epic of Gilgamesh for the first time for Penguin Classics, but she was she went hunting on a donkey.
Oh, really?
Which is very Sylvia Townsend Warner, but almost impossible.
Yeah.
But there are she showed me pictures of her when she was a little girl.
What do you hunt on a donkey?
Well, I mean, I think in those days it would have been a fox. But slowly, obviously.
So
She pops up in. I was reading Julia Blackman's book about John Craske. It's called Threads.
Yes.
And so John Craske was this, fisherman who had a terrible sort of injury during the war, and then he was sort of confined to his bed, and he started painting because he couldn't really do. He had to be lying down, and he started doing embroidery, and he wouldn't have, sold any of his work, really, if it wasn't for Sylvia Townsend Warner and Valentine Ackland, because they championed him. I think because they liked outsiders, and outlaws and people who were on the edges.
The thing about Sylvia Townsend Warner, I just want to say a little bit about about her other novels, which is so different from one another. But like J.L. Carr's novels, the more of them you read, the more depth you can see in them. I read last week, after the death of Don Juan, on the recommendation of John from the LRB bookshop, who had grabbed me by the arm and said, she is the greatest novelist of the century. Wow. And you've got to read this book. And thanks, John, it was fantastic. It retells the story of Don Juan.
What's the book called?
After the Death of Don Juan.
Oh, After the Death of Don Juan.
And it retells the events from Mozart's opera from the perspective of the villagers who have to put up with it. And while being simultaneously a metaphor for the Spanish Civil War in a way which starts off as amusing and ends up utterly passionate. It's a wonderful book. I've never read anything like it. But the other novel I read was a novel that she wrote 10 years later called The Corner That Held Them, which is about 50 years in the life of a 14th century convent.
Great.
It is a masterpiece. I think Lolly Willowes is a fantastic book. I thought After the Death of Don Juan was great. The Corner That Held Them is the best novel I've read for months and months and months. It has no plot. All the nuns talk rather like you would expect Sylvia Townsend Warner and her friends to talk. And yet it is so exquisitely made in terms of evoking time and place, and it's funny and it's passionate. And I've never read anything like it. I realise one of the great boons about doing this podcast is we get to immerse ourselves for a week or two in these wonderful writers. So it's not just the novel that you bring, Samantha. And it's also just getting to know a writer.
I want to go and read all of them. There's just great titles as well. I mean, Mr. Fortune's Maggot.
That's very funny and very good.
The Corner That Held Them, and then her last novel, The Flint Anchor. I mean, there's such a great title.
Samantha, you were saying that Summer Will Show is really good.
Summer Will Show is very good. It's a woman who goes off to revolutionary France to chase down her husband, who is seeing another woman, and she just gets more interested in his mistress, and she also gets swept up into revolutionary politics and discovers her sort of anarchists,
But that's the amazing thing about we're saying the books are different from one another, but certain things that they have in common, like The Corner That Held Them, is a deeply communistic novel. It's a Marxian reading of the economics of British society in the 14th century seen through the accounts of a convent.
I mean, a Marxist witch who writes brilliant English sentences. I mean, what honestly is not to like?
They're just incredibly subversive, all the books of hers, I think, that I've read, which isn't all of them, but they're incredibly subversive. They take nothing as sacred, from the resonant voice of the clergyman to anything else, and she just encourages you to sort of take things down, if you want to, and to sort of look at the world in a new way. It feels very refreshing to read her, I think.
Sarah Waters says that she's relatively underappreciated. She said in her introduction to Lolly Willowes, a fact that baffles, frustrates, and I think secretly pleases her admirers. Because she's the kind of novelist who inspires an intense sense of ownership, which I sort of can see that. It's not, you're not going to tell everybody you know to read her, but the people who you would love this kind of. I mean, I think she is extraordinary. Line
by line, she's wonderful. She's so funny, and she does surprise you on every page. I think I found it very surprising to read her novels.
Humour, Marxism, witchcraft. With that, we have to end. Thanks to Samantha Ellis, and of course, always to Mathew, and to our sponsors, Unbound. You can get in touch with us on Twitter @BacklistedPod, on Facebook at facebook.com/backlistedpod. I am reading a script here. and on our page
on it beautifully done.
Testify, John.
And
on
our page on the Unbound site at unbound.co.uk /backlisted. Thanks for listening. We'll be back with another show in a fortnight. Until from me, goodbye, and
thanks very much, everybody. See you next time. You can choose to listen to Backlisted with or without adverts. If you prefer to listen to it without adverts, you can join us on our Patreon at patreon.com/backlisted, where you also get bonus content of 2 episodes of Locklisted, the podcast where we talk about the books and films and music that we've been listening to over the last couple of weeks.